more allegations involving suggestions and allegations of abusive behaviour. In your judgment, because it clearly, I think, escalates what is already a crisis for the BBC, does it take us nearer to a tipping point?
Well, I suspect it will very quickly force the presenter to come out into the open. But to be honest, John, I find the whole thing so Kafkaesque and ridiculous. Did you know there was a BBC corporate investigations unit? What on earth for? I mean, are we in the age of John Reith when people could be fired for committing adultery? I mean, the original allegation was either of criminal action, in which case it's nothing to do with the BBC, it's a police matter, or it wasn't criminal, in which case it's something that's going on between consenting adults. And again, what's the BBC doing investigating it? The BBC has scored one of the most comprehensive own goals of its long history in getting in the middle of all this. When the parents phoned the BBC, what did they expect the BBC to do? If I'd been Tim Davie, I'd have said, here is the number of your local police station. And if they had said, well, the police say there's no illegality involved, I would have said, well, what do you expect me to do? Is your child not an adult? Have you spent 3 years just watching this all happen? Why can't the 20-year-old speak for himself or herself? So it's invited every man and his dog and politician, and that's a separate category, separate breed, to pile in on the BBC, do the investigation, get it done quickly. This is all very serious. It's not something for the BBC to get entangled in the first place. If what it turns out to be is something scandalous or unwise or inappropriate, as Schofield might have called it, then eventually the BBC presenter will be out in the open and will have to decide for himself whether he can pursue his career.
Right.
But it's not a disciplinary offence to have a relationship, even with someone 30 years younger than you.
Right. Okay. I was interested to hear your take on this, David. To be honest, I'm a little surprised at just how black and white your view seems to be, which comes down to the view misconduct is misconduct only insofar as it breaks the law, that it becomes a police matter. Anything outside that very strict definition can be no business of the employer of a particular. Am I summarising your view correctly?
No, you're not, because if it was, say, financial misconduct, if someone said so-and-so presenter has been using his BBC expense account to do X and Y and Z,
yes,
it might not amount to criminality, but it would certainly be an abuse of his position at the BBC and liable to disciplinary proceedings.
But even though I wonder why a former leader of Channel 5 would make that assertion in support of the point you're making, because to misuse expenses are legitimate expenses for the purpose of helping or furthering your legitimate duty. If you're using it for a false purpose, that is quite simply fraud. Not every such case ends up in a court and a charge of fraud, but it is a fraud. Now, is it not?
Very, very few of them end up as fraud because there's usually it doesn't justify police investigation and court prosecution time. It's left to the employer to say, cheerio, farewell.
Yeah, I concede that. I concede that, David, and we're not here to discuss questions. But let me put my question to you then, just to understand the point that you're making. If I may, David, just for the sake of clarity, if I may. So look, you would have been the boss of employees, of presenters, who would have signed contracts. And I'd be surprised if the contract didn't include some sort of clause that said an employee or a contractor to Channel 5 is obliged to do nothing that brings Channel 5 or themselves into disrepute. Surely you would have such a clause. Right. And so the allegations, I stress, we haven't had due process in either of these cases, but the allegations in the second case, the most recent, seem to have digital, hard forensic evidence to support them. But The conduct described there surely comes into the conduct of, if proved, it would bring that presenter and thereby the BBC into disrespect. How is it possible to deny that?
Well, it might not. But until you actually see what the messages were, I mean, given the amount of internet trolling that goes on, 50% of the country would lose their jobs if sending an expletive or a threat online was considered a breach of your employment contract. I mean, this has all got completely out of kilter. I mean, Tim Davie was today asked by the media editor of The Guardian, has the BBC inspected the presenter's phone? Seriously?
Yes.
I mean, we're in Stasi land here.
Really?
What on earth could justify the BBC confiscating the presenter's phone and demanding to examine its contents?
Well, let me then put an answer to you for the sake of this conversation. I put these points not because I've got an axe to grind against the BBC, which happens to be my old employer. It's because I think these are reasonable questions, and I think they're supported by logic, let alone the evidence. If a senior figure at the BBC who is held necessarily in respect and for many admiration by the audience, by the very large audience of the corporation, commits various acts or indulges in conduct which lowers them significantly in the eyes of a significant number of people, that is damaging, not just to them, but to the role that they do and by extension to the BBC. I put that to you as a straightforward contention. Do you dispute it?
It might not. Look, if David Attenborough announced he was having an affair with a 17-year-old girl, we'd all be extremely surprised, but it wouldn't justify anyone saying, oh, I'm not going to employ him ever again.
But we're talking about abusive conduct, David, not a private relationship. No, the allegation is of abusive conduct. Well, the report on the BBC, the report on the BBC website describes it in those terms, and it says that the messages which have therefore been seen at the BBC have been traced to the phone of the presenter in question. So the report could not stand as a piece of accurate reporting unless the test of is it or is it not abusive have been passed.
Well, I'm afraid the word abusive covers an awful lot of space.
Yeah.
And you can have outright vitriol, or you can have you blackmailer, or you dirty dealer. Why are you threatening to expose me?
Yes.
Which is abusive and is threatening, but would I suspend someone or, more importantly, fire them? Absolutely not. You've got to have some sense of proportion here. Now, when it all comes out, it may turn out that the presenter has been multiply, not just indiscreet, but in breach of his duties to the BBC and even of the criminal law. So be it. But it's not the BBC's job to be a law enforcement agency. It's the police's job. And getting the two things confused, as we've recently seen with the police asking the BBC to suspend their investigation, is terrible. And as I said to you at the very beginning, did you know there was such an investigations unit when you were working at the BBC?